Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this webinar on maximizing value from LiDAR investments. I'm Carly, I'm Foresight's Marketing and Sales Coordinator, and I'm going to walk us through a few housekeeping items before we get started. Just to give you a brief background on Foresight, we're a full-service forest management company with 9 offices and approximately 140 staff across Canada, primarily in Western Canada. And we've been providing innovative and cost-effective solutions to government and industry clients for the past 33 years. Our presentation today will begin with Cam Brown, who is manager of Foresight's Resource Management and Technology team. Cam's a professional forester with over 25 years of experience in the forest sector, primarily in consulting roles in Western Canada. Following Cam's presentation, we'll have Jamie Black, forestry supervisor and LiDAR operational planning lead, and he'll discuss how the tools and technology have changed the way we do planning. Jamie's also a professional forester who's been working on the operational side of the industry for the past 10 years. So without further ado, let me welcome my colleague, Cam. Okay, Cam.
Awesome. Thanks very much, Carly. Yeah, so I'm Cam, I'm the strategic guy. Jamie's operational, he keeps me real, so he'll correct me later probably. The webinar today hopefully is going to share our experience working with LiDAR and how we think it's best to maximize value from that LiDAR. We've had a lot of experience and we would hope to share that with you today here. We're going to start off by just quickly doing a description of the base products that come with a LiDAR acquisition, talk about some of the value-added products that can be derived from those base products, talk about how they're used in operational planning setting and how that can change outcomes, and how we can look at it from a non-timber values management perspective as well. And then at the very end, we'll just talk briefly about making data accessible to users and how to do that in the best way. So our experience is that organizations are realizing different levels of ROI because some are realizing cost savings through timber development and planning, some through better value extraction from the forest using new forest inventories, and some are using it to make better informed risk management decisions, whether it be from terrain or water, visuals, or habitat. I think the real key though is that what really frustrates us is when we see people just using LiDAR data to make more detailed maps and continuing on with business as usual. That's really, in our opinion, we're only getting about 10% of the value coming out of the LiDAR acquisition. So there's a lot more, and the point of today's webinar is really about trying to leverage the full value of that LiDAR product. So goal for today is really hopefully for you to each take away at least one new idea on how LiDAR might be able to be used to improve your business. I'm going to start off by just showing you a point cloud. LiDAR is basically a collection of 3-dimensional points. So each point has an X, Y, Z coordinate, and the collection of points together can help describe terrain, vegetation, and any number of things. This happens to be in East Kootenays. It's about an 8 to 10 points per pulse per meter LiDAR collection. You can see the pointy top conifer trees. You can see the rounded top deciduous trees. You can see logs in the river. You'll be able to see the guardrails on the railway there in a minute. So very, very detailed information can be gathered from an eye, but really that's just a collection of millions and millions of points with X, Y, Z. Happens to be themed based on height, so obviously blue is the ground and red is the tallest trees. That gives you a bit of a sense of what a LiDAR point cloud is. Point clouds can be collected in a number of different ways. A careful distinction to make is that if it's collected from a photogrammetric process, i.e. stereo photos, you end up getting really just a surface look of what's on the ground or what's in the image. You get some really interesting perspectives from that data, but it's not the same as a LiDAR point cloud, which tends to penetrate down and get a really good canopy structure as well as ground control. There's different types of ways of collecting that LiDAR data, and I'm not going to go into that here, but just be aware they're not all the same, and you have to treat them a little bit differently. And there's also the distinction between LiDAR that's collected from the air and LiDAR that's collected from the ground, whether it be a handheld machine or a truck or a backpack. Very high point densities realized from these handheld units. The image you see here on your right is a handheld walkthrough of a plot on the ground, so very fine density, high density points below, with an aerial cloud sewn into it from above. So you can see the density from the aerial cloud and what was captured from the LiDAR cloud, the terrestrial cloud from below. I'm not going to spend a lot of time listing off the products here because we're going to walk through them, but when you do an acquisition, the base products that you really get are a point cloud, which we refer to as an LAZ or LAS data set, and then a whole series of other things can be derived from that. So a digital elevation model, a digital surface model, a canopy height model, a bare earth hillshade, full feature hillshade, and then contours. And we can also do value-added products called things like slope themes, aspect themes, streams, watershed boundaries, alluvial fans, and forest inventory data. So let's take a look at what those things look like. So this is always an interesting image. It's called a full feature hillshade, and it's really, again, like what you would see from that photogrammetric cloud. It's showing the surface of everything that was scanned. So you're seeing treetops, you're seeing road surfaces, you're seeing transmission lines, and even a kind of a water body with a bit of vegetation on top of it. Dramatically more detail than what we would have had historically, coming from, say, a VRI file or some kind of a forest cover inventory. Very, very detailed look at what's underneath, what the surface of the terrain looks like. When we strip away the vegetation, only the ground points that are collected in the LiDAR can be used to derive a DEM, a digital elevation model, and something like this, which is called a bare earth hillshade. So again, we can see the road surfaces and even cuts and fills in some cases. You can see the surface of the water now, and very, very distinct changes in topography. A set of 1 meter, actually these are 5 meter contours. The 1 meter's got too dense for the image, so these are 5 meter contours that are shown on the image, compared to, say, a 20 meter contour that you might have had historically. So really significantly large improvements in what we're able to discern from the terrain with a LiDAR collection. 20 meter contours are usually based on a point every 75 meters across the landscape and extrapolations between those points. We're now talking about having multiple points in each meter to produce the terrain surface. With that really detailed terrain surface, we can do things like generate very stream networks of very, very high detail. We can't always guarantee when a stream is present or not, but we do know where water accumulates, and through flow accumulation models, we can predict where we believe streams will be. We can also use that terrain information to generate very detailed slope themes that are very flexible, and/or aspect themes to understand what aspect might an area be sitting in. Along with that flow accumulation modeling, we can use those to develop what we call a topographic wetness index. So here, dark blue is wet, and the light colors are not as wet. You can see the very fine detail that we can generate to understand where in the landscape water is and where it isn't. Just for context here, so this is a cut block that was about right here. You can see the leave area that was left along the riparian areas. Correlates very well with the wet areas mapped on this map. So even in areas with in non-steep terrain, so out in the prairies, flatland, understanding what is wet and what is not wet, where to get roads and what's winter ground, what's versus summer harvest. Those kinds of things can really be fleshed out with products like this topographic wetness index. So we move away from terrain information and we talk a little bit about how we assess the vegetation that comes out of LiDAR data. First thing we get is the default product called a canopy height model, which is basically telling you how tall is the vegetation in any 1 square meter or half square meter, or whatever resolution you choose to create it at. And so you get this heat map on height. Blue is the ground, red is the tallest trees. And you can see how it compares to traditional inventory information, where this polygon here was considered 25 meters tall and 600 stems per hectare. You can see that we've got taller trees over here that are more dense, shorter trees over here, less dense, and more dense and shorter over here. So a lot of variation that we would never have been able to appreciate in a traditional forest inventory is immediately available to us as soon as we get a canopy height model. And there's no value added cost to this. When you get a LiDAR acquisition, the canopy height model is in your hands right away. compare that to a polygon up here that it's supposed to be denser, 900 stems per hectare and 28 meters tall. It does look taller because of the trees are brighter red, but they're certainly less dense out in the landscape. So canopy height model is a very powerful tool. It allows us to really get at heights across the land base. Sometimes those heights can be a little bit underestimated, but typically only with low point densities. So you're missing the very top of the tree if the laser pulses didn't hit the top of the tree. Or they can be sometimes overestimated if you have very steep terrain and leaning trees. So the treetop is leaning out over the slope, and the measurement between the top of the tree and the ground is kind of adding height to it because the stump's actually a little further uphill. But again, we can compensate for those. The vast majority of the time, heights measured through LiDAR are as good or better than what's measured from the ground. Our challenge, though, becomes when we have individual height locations. I can click on that particular point. It'll tell me what the height of that vegetation clump is. But you can see the variability of heights in this polygon. If we assign a single height to that polygon, it becomes a bit of a statistical challenge to avoid the anomalies, and simply taking averages generally doesn't work. So we worked out a number of algorithms that solve the problem. Another easy to grab metric coming out of a LiDAR acquisition from a forest inventory perspective is something like crown cover. Using that same canopy height model, blue's the ground, red's the tallest trees again. So you can kind of see where the canopies are and where they're not. You can do a simple approach to say, everything that's at least 3 meters above the ground won't be brush and shrubs and vegetation, it'll be trees. So we can say, hey, everything over 3 meters is orange. What percent of this polygon is orange? And we get a very clean, consistent estimate of crown cover across our landscape. Unfortunately, that specific simple metric I just described doesn't work everywhere. So again, we've developed algorithms to deal with some of the anomalies of different circumstances. But again, very clean, objective information that can be taken across your land base, and we're not relying on interpreters to subjectively estimate crown cover percentages. Using those heights and crown covers, you could do something simple like update existing inventory polygons. Something like this polygon would call it 50% crown closure and 13.2 meters tall, or something like this is 34 meters tall and 82% crown closure. Again, consistent and objective across the land base. There are some subtleties to the way those are calculated to make sure that you're not dealing with strange polygons. If this polygon here happened to not be accurately mapped and captured a bunch of mature trees in it, then you have to be more careful and deal with those circumstances. Again, algorithms have been developed to do that. What if we want to add more detail to these inventories? So if we want more than just height and crown closure, we want things like species, stem counts, basal area, diameters, volume, and even log products. How do we get at that? Ideally, we want to work with an inventory that tells us more than what these traditional inventory polygons would have done, and work with what I would call an operational scale inventory. So I'm going to just walk through a couple of examples of value-added products of how you get out these inventories. The first and easiest and low-cost option you can do that gives you some of those metrics is just to basically create a tree map location. So map out where all the trees are and assign a height and crown metrics to each tree. Canopy height model here, an algorithm runs over that canopy height model or through the point cloud. In our case, we use the point cloud, and it will identify a crown of each tree, or what it believes to be each tree. Never perfect. It'll certainly miss trees sometimes and double count trees sometimes, but it gives you quite a good estimate of the trees and tree sizes that are out there. The picture on the left here kind of shows it in 3D, where the segmentation algorithm has identified a tree and a tree and a tree. And over here, we isolated out the exact location of the volume of the area that encompasses that tree, and then we can then do calculations to estimate what is the height to live crown ratio, what is the size of the crown, what is the volume of the crown. But that only gives you certain metrics on the tree. But one thing that we are pretty excited about, in the last year, we managed to refine our segmentation algorithm so that we're able to capture understory trees. Almost all the commercially available solutions I've seen, and even the free ones, only segment trees in the upper canopy. If they're not visible from the upper canopy, it's not able to find trees down inside the canopy. So this is an example of an aspen stand with some spruce understory. And we did a project in Alberta with Canfor to make sure that we could identify the presence or absence of this conifer understory underneath a deciduous overstory. Okay, so we want to actually get to volumes and basal areas and those kinds of things. We've got a couple other options. The first one I'm going to talk about here is the area-based approach, where we basically get pixels or tiles across our landscape. So in this case, we've got a 20 meter by 20 meter tile. We can extract the LiDAR underneath that tile, that cube of data, compare that data to what we find on the ground in that exact same location, and then use predictive relationships to say when LiDAR looks like this, there's 200 cubes per meter on the ground, and then extrapolate that across the land base. It works really well for things like volume, basal area, top height, biomass. Works okay for things like stems per hectare and pea size. Doesn't work at all for species. So the challenge with this product, it's a well-proven product. There's a CFS publication for best practices. It's always evolving to improve outcomes, but there are some limitations in the sense that you can't get at species and you really can't get at log products and pea size very well because it's tough to get individual trees counts outside of this block of data. But what it does give you is a much finer resolution inventory to understand volume and height and basal area, how it might be distributed across the land base. You know, one forest cover polygon can have a really wide range of values within that single polygon, and you can understand that with this type of data. To get at the full meal deal, we've got an approach that uses individual tree based identification. So as you saw in the first option where you could identify each individual tree and then analyze those trees, we've developed machine learning approaches to analyze those individual trees and predict species for each tree. So we'll have a known library of trees that this is a balsam, a spruce, a fir, a pine, and we have thousands of replicas of those in the library, and we customize them to the area of interest, and then we use machine learning to predict the species of the tree. Once we have the species of the tree, we can predict a diameter at its base based on the relationship between height, species, and competitive index, how densely it's growing. And then once we have the diameter and the height and the species, we can basically bucket up like a cruise comp would and calculate volumes and log products to whatever utilization standard someone might want to have. And that gives us the ability to then summarize data in a very, very detailed way, similar to a cruise, but across the landscape. So here we're looking at an operational scale inventory. You certainly see the species here. This is supposedly a pure pine polygon. This is supposedly a pure spruce balsam polygon, but you can see the bleeding between the two. The typer's done a decent job of capturing it, but certainly there's value in understanding a finer resolution. And each one of those trees has a size, a diameter, and log products associated with it. So if you could take this exact same inventory and create the area-based approach kind of on the left, volume per hectare on each tile, and then you take volume per tree on the right, both of them have strengths and weaknesses. But what we've done is we've kind of looked at them and said, okay, how do we bring them together to make a hybrid product that brings the best of both worlds? So ultimately, the full meal deal comes from bringing the two together, where you end up with an area-based looking product, but it has attributes that work a lot like an individual tree inventory. So log products, tree distributions, and so on, which allows us to do something like, select a bunch of pixels in an area that might be equivalent to a block of interest, and then get a profile of the number of trees by height class and an average diameter for each of those classes. And obviously it has species as well because it's inheriting that from the individual tree work. Once we have that really solid operational scale inventory, our goal is to then aggregate that up to a strategic inventory that can be used in a timber supply process. And we then assign site index and age to those polygons, and then have a very strong connection between the strategic inventory and the operational inventory. And the real benefit of this is that it can be done really quite quickly, much more quickly than what a traditional photo inter process would take. something that might take years in a photo interp world can be done in a month instead. So key value points on the forest inventory side is really that there is a range of options out there, and it's a matter of kind of picking one that best suits your needs and objectives, whether it's operational, strategic, or if you have a new current inventory or old, we can work with you to decide what might be the best option there. Producing the full inventory product that we just talked about that includes species and all the log products, so it's a much richer product than most traditional photo inventory processes, but it can be done very quickly, and it's pretty cost competitive with a traditional photo inventory, but it's a lot richer data set. We do still use photo interp though to support non-forest attributes and to do some checking in terms of the final product. One of the key attributes that we've heard from clients on this is that the products are consistent and objective across the land base. So while they're never perfect, where the clients start to see issues that might be leaning in one particular way or another, based on their ground experience and experience with the inventory, they can start to make adjustments and say, hey, in this area maybe there's a little more spruce than what the inventory is showing, and they can make those adaptations across a land base. Again, because it's automated and consistent, you can adjust the information. And there's a really compelling argument to be made between a strong link between the operational scale data and the strategic inventory so that we can find the AEC on the ground. Okay, so that's a bunch about the products. I'm going to turn it over to Jamie Black for a bit to talk about the value of LiDAR in an operational planning setting, and then we'll come back to talk about the non-timber stuff in a minute. Go ahead, Jamie.
Okay, thanks, Cam, and good morning, everyone. As Cam indicated, I'm going to speak to the operational planning portion of the presentation. Before I get started and dive into things, I'd like to acknowledge and extend a thanks to Danazol Timber for allowing us to use their data. So, operational planning using LiDAR, where's the value? Most of us have for pillars of success on our business are based on safety, quality, and production. So how do we realize the value of LiDAR while considering these pillars? So essentially, LiDAR has changed the game, and basically the blindfold has come off. The full value of your LiDAR is realized by far more informed pre-planning at the onset. We can see a lot more through the lens of LiDAR prior to putting boots on the ground. And basically, the more complex or remote the block or blocks are, the bigger the savings you'll be able to realize. So, from a safety perspective, and with this in mind, during the pre-planning for field operations, we can create a far more robust safety plan prior to going into the field. We can avoid making too many assumptions that have traditionally been taken from an ortho or, involved expensive helicopter flights or whatnot. Initial site safety assessments are better informed through office-based pre-planning, and site assessments can be modified once we're on the ground, as opposed to getting on the ground, then figuring out the safety concerns and how to mitigate those concerns. In this example, with far more information available to help us, we have a better idea of where initial landing zones might be. We know where really steep cliffs are to avoid. There's just a lot more information when we go from this to when we go to this. We can really pick out some of those spots where we can put down. We can tell whether we can put down without worrying about trees, or where we could set down and make an opening. Bottom line is, it's about reducing the time on the ground like this. That will help with the safety factor. So, okay, so quality and production. It's difficult to talk and describe one without the other. With the use of LiDAR, we really need to make a paradigm shift from what we used to do, use during pre-planning phase of the field operations to what we can do now with what data is available. A few items we'll be able to know before heading into the woods with a fairly high degree of confidence is, our road locations, grades, decking room, landings, block boundary locations, while knowing species composition, volume. We'll know what harvesting systems we need. We can sort out deflection lines, and what we can, with the wet area mapping and such, we'll be able to understand stream locations. Basically, we can cut down on a lot of wandering. Control points will be identified up front and addressed. And in a lot of cases, once boots are on the ground, we're assessing reasonableness of the plan as we hang the ribbon. So let's take a quick walk down memory lane. Most of us are used to seeing something like this or have seen it in the past or even see it now. I mean, we have our 20-meter contour lines. We have our VRI polygon. Sometimes we have the information of the polygon. Sometimes we don't. We know it's roadside. Hey, that's great. And, there's some trim streams on there. Basically, we have a 72-hectare blob that we need to figure out what to do. So this is kind of a typical thing that I've seen in the past. We get LiDAR and we're able to make some nice maps. We have far more information at our fingertips. We understand the slope gradient. We have a canopy height model that kind of breaks down and what we can expect to see on the ground. It helps isolate areas of interest. Basically, we can put these maps in our tablet and off we go. But this is just a pretty map. Some would say as Cam alluded to, we're only using 10% of the potential value. So I think we can do better. So planning the boundary location, we're able to identify areas that are inoperable or not worth going, or at least we're aware of potential areas of inoperability along this LiDAR-derived stream with some, potential cliff features, or over on this side where there's just no timber worth going at. So from a production perspective, we're cutting down on recce by a significant margin. I mean, this particular boundary that I have drawn out in black has gone from the original 72-hectare blob down to 40 hectares. That's significant. And like I said, when it comes to laying out the boundary eventually, for the most part, we can follow the blue dot on our tablets, but I will caveat that statement with we still need experienced folks out there assessing the reasonableness. And from a quality perspective, we exclude what we don't want, but we can also make sure that we're not isolating timber as well. So road location. One of the more important aspects of block and total chance planning is road location. Getting the location of the road in the correct spot can be a major cost saver. Doing the pre-planning in the office allows for, as I indicated before, less wandering around. We already know where most, if not all, of the control points are. We know, where stream crossings are. We know when we're in a potential issue area, if you will. We have a really good idea of what our decking might be. We have a really good idea of where we might be able to put a landing. Basically, better road locations, plus decking, landing options equals cost savings. Just to speak a little bit more to the location of roads, for foresight ops planners, we have the added benefit of using a LiDAR add-in tool that is used in the ArcMap environment. Using our LiDAR tool gives a better idea of what we can encounter along the proposed alignment, and it allows for quick analysis on various aspects of the road. So just as an example, this is kind of a spit out of kind of what the proposed road alignment might look like for grades if we're really concerned about what we're seeing. Once the road location is kind of pegged in, and if potential concerns exist that cannot be, answered using the LiDAR tool, then basically we would take that spatial feature or the alignment and take it into Road Engine, and we would drape that particular feature over the LiDAR, and we would get a better sense of what's happening. Another cost saver. Unlike the past where we'd attempt to do the minimum amount of D-lines in the bush, we can do as many as we want when we're pre-planning in the office. We can really focus on where we might find the deflection problems or deflection issues. In this particular example, you can see where I proposed the roads, and I'm pulling all the D-lines off of these roads. I'll show you what a deflection line image will look like once we're ready to do the analysis part of it. But you can, along here where it's steep, we'll know that we're using stump rigging tail holds, and along here we'll probably prescribe a mobile backspar, all of which will be checked once the boots are on the ground. You'll notice in areas where I don't have deflection lines, but basically either the deflection didn't work, but I did a slope analysis using the tool, and we figured we can do some hoe chucking, or it'll just be a steep slope conventional show. So obviously from a production point of view, there's no hiking up and down hills, and there's no need to be doing D-line calculations in the bush while fighting off bugs and all that good stuff. And from a quality point of view, the LiDAR picks up a lot of the small things that we might actually take for granted as we're bombing up and down the hillside, right, with our clinos. It could reduce the potential for ground lead and all that kind of stuff. And we avoid making mistakes incurred by note-taking errors and lead to costly decisions created by those areas. So you can notice that I highlighted one of the D lines here. So this is just a kind of an example of what a deflection line analysis report would look like. It gives us lots of good information. Basically, this is the ground profile derived from the DEM. We're able to set our yard or height. We can indicate what our backspar will look like, whether it's a stump rig tail hold or whether we have a mobile backspar. And we use a simple thirds method for calculating the deflection, and we can set our % cable deflection right here. And we're also able to attribute a block or a deflection ID so that you can tie back this particular deflection line analysis with the spatial that we're already creating within the ArcMap environment. And like I said before, we can then actually put in some mobile backspar trails, all of which can be ground truths once we get folks on the ground, make sure it's all good and reasonable. So we're kind of at the point where we can start tying everything together without individual tree inventory or really good imagery. This is about as far as we can take it in the office. However, if you're able to take your LiDAR acquisition and the subsequent products to the next level, which is the individual tree inventory, we can basically take that individual tree inventory and use the LiDAR tool to get some pretty interesting timber revelations. So in this example, this is the block that I've proposed, that I've been using as an example, and we've themed each individual tree within that block, and you can notice right away. So, I'm not really hunting for aspen and cottonwood, which is themed as pink. And we can all of a sudden see kind of like there's a fairly large conglomerate of it. So I isolated the aspen, and this is the distribution throughout the block. So clearly I have to sort this out. So you know, instead of sending the crew out with the notion that from the canopy height model, this is really great timber, but in actual fact, we have a lot of aspen. So we can then, and it did, although this slide doesn't show it overly well, I was able to get rid of that aspen and just tighten up the boundary a little bit more. Further to the using the LiDAR tool with the ITI, we can also take that polygon, and within that polygon set a bunch of parameters, click on a button, and we get a very cruise type-esque information available. So you can actually even apply this prior to even developing your block. If you actually aren't sure what's in it, you can just draw a polygon around it and click a button, set your species categories, a few other key timber attributes, and this is what you can get. It's a really powerful tool. It's really handy to help with the pre-planning. So to kind of bring it all back, I'm hoping that what I'm telling you here today is kind of going to help you kind of get that paradigm shift going. I think we're able to move from this, and really we can get things to a point even before we put boots on the ground to this point. And I think it's going to save us a lot of time and add value to your business. So some of the speaking points or key value points I really want to emphasize is the LiDAR data and products has changed timber development and the pre-planning that we're doing. The LiDAR data and the new development approaches result in less boots on the ground. Reduces recce time. It speeds up certain phases that we would normally be doing out in the bush, and it gives us a more informed picture of what's out there. And we reduce potential for really bad outcomes. You know, I mean, logging's an expensive part of the whole process. We have logger feedback on some of the harvesting maps that we've produced for them, and they love it. And the highest savings realized is definitely in complex terrain or remote locations, but it can also be applied quite well. And I've experienced this on the ground in a flatland situation where water, not so much steep terrain, but water is something that we need to take into consideration and manage for. And you know, the take-home message is don't just make better maps. So with that, I'll hand it back to Cam.
Awesome, thanks, Jamie. Yeah, some really good messages there about you know, doing the pre-planning before you head out. You know, for us, it really helps having the ArcMap tool built in, allows us to remain in the ArcMap environment and be really efficient at developing these pre-plans. And you know, it does apply across a wide range of terrain. Sometimes the complex conventional terrain can be just as challenging as deflection lines. Okay, so I'm going to kind of try to finish out the back half here with a bit of a talk about applications in non-timber forest management or other forest management applications. So, you know, forestry is all about terrain and vegetation. So if we have better information for terrain and vegetation, really the sky's the limit on what we can do to improve our management processes. I'm going to walk you through some of the examples that you know, we've been experiencing the last while. We've already talked about the ability to generate some very detailed stream networks. Based on those stream networks, you can simply pick a point on any stream, and it will immediately identify all of the area that drains to that point. So it becomes a drainage point with a defined drainage area above it. That can serve a purpose for something like a culvert sizing, or just simply defining a watershed area definitively with very, very detailed terrain information. When we have a watershed, we often want to understand kind of the cumulative effect or effects or the disturbance level within a watershed to know if we should continue to harvest there or we need to back off for a while. In order to assess that, we look at hydrologic recovery, which is really linked to the height regrowth after harvest. So as the stand regrows to a mature level, its recovery, aka like a non-harvested stand, increases over time. So understanding the heights of younger stands and their progression over time is really critical. And the canopy height model is a very accurate way to get estimates of young stand heights, much more accurate typically than in polygon inventories, because the surveys out in the ground aren't done very often, and it's more difficult to get estimates of what those appropriate heights are. So a LiDAR-based height and then projecting that LiDAR-based height over time is quite an effective way to do that. Another thing hydrologists recognize is their ability to understand where drainage diversions are happening. This block had some kind of gentle over steep terrain, and the hydrologist was very keen to understand where these historical drainage patterns were being diverted by old trails. So using the Hillshade, we were able to map out those trail locations. And another, similar applications, we've actually used this data to estimate the widths of roads and trails to support timber supply modeling assumptions and so on. And in caribou habitat, understand what the regrowth heights are on disturbed areas, seismic lines or old roads. Are they recovering or are they not recovering? Mapping of active fluvial units is another way we use LiDAR data. In this particular case, the hydrologist drew this polygon without the benefit of LiDAR, and you can see pretty clearly how it might be refined if they had the benefit of LiDAR when they drew it. This is a different fan that was drawn with the benefit of LiDAR. Most of the water funnels down out this way, but there's a whole bunch of braided, historical channels out over this fan over here that have become really quite evident with the LiDAR data. We use LiDAR quite often now to support refined visual impact assessments. If the terrain on the landscape that we're assessing has LiDAR data, our ability to put the block on the landscape and then identify retention areas, whether they be individual trees or clumps of trees, and position those, knowing their height and location, is just that much more accurate, and we get more realistic renderings of what the proposed development might look like. And at a larger scale, you can use LiDAR to do something similar and say, okay, if I have a viewpoint from here on this recreational corridor, what is visible from that location? So everything, in this case, everything that's themed red is visible from that location. You can repeat that same process from viewpoints along these lakes, and then compile a composite that shows the total area that's visible along that corridor, and then plan your cut blocks accordingly. You kind of get a free out if it's not visible at all, and then where it is visible, the number of viewpoints that it's visible from may influence the degree to which you adapt your development. Obviously, terrain and avalanche assessments are greatly supported by detailed terrain data. In this particular case, there was a big headscarp discovered in this area. It was able to focus the geotech's efforts to really address issues of concern, as opposed to kind of just walking the block and seeing what he finds. It's a targeted process of understanding what the concerns or hazards might be, and then targeting the field review of those. Avalanches in a similar way, understanding terrain, where avalanche is likely to funnel to, and how far they'll flow. All things can be supported by the terrain data. Cultural features. This is an interesting one. We delivered some LiDAR data to a First Nation in BC, and they were looking at the data and immediately picked out some pit house remnants that they knew of. And they started scanning the map and identified additional areas of pit houses that at least the people looking at the map at the time, weren't aware of at the time. So its fine detail is able to pull out some very, very unique situations that you peel off all the vegetation and able to look at that terrain. Lots of interesting things start to pop out. Wildlife habitat assessments is another really important application of having better vegetation information. Historically, if we've known this block as a certain height and crown closure, but when we actually look at it, we can understand it in all its detail. This is an unharvested area, and this is residual trees left within a partially harvested area. Being able to describe what's actually there as opposed to more generic attributes lets us do a better job of describing wildlife habitat. Because our real goal is to replace a simple age definition for habitat structures to something that's more linked to the structure itself. So whether it's a range of tree sizes, diameters and heights, canopy characteristics, or tree species, all of which we can get at a much finer resolution. If we can link habitat structures to those habitat use to these detailed stand structures, we get a better outcome for managing for habitat. An example of that was a project we did in the East Kootenays to map under the winter range and assess snow interception cover for kind of winter habitat and understand the early cereal conditions that really serve as kind of groceries or feeding areas. The LiDAR helped us improve the mapping of those disturbances and the internal retention in the partial harvested areas, quantify the stems per hectare that were inside young cereal areas to decide if they truly were acting as young cereal or not. And we improved the confidence in our cover conditions because the crown cover percentages in the inventory were, let's just say, a bit lacking. Overall, we got a more accurate measure of habitat conditions. And the next step on this project was really kind of reverse it. Instead of defining habitat and trying to look for it, how do we, maybe we could track the animals and link them to particular types of habitat that they're using, and therefore better actually define what types of habitat need to be retained or managed for. Other wildlife projects we've been involved in relate to finding goshawk habitat on Vancouver Island. Goshawks require flyways underneath canopy structure, so high canopy with self-pruning down below, so these corridors or flyways underneath canopy. LiDAR was very helpful at helping us pick out those flyways, and then linking the spatial proximity of those hunting areas with nesting habitat as well. Williamson sapsucker habitat in Logan Lake Community Forest was broadly defined as potential habitat in all of these colored areas, just based on some ecosystem mapping. But if we could use the individual tree inventory, we could find large diameter ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, deciduous trees in an open canopy setting and look for those candidates that might suit sapsucker. And able to map the full extent of the habitat into kind of a low, moderate, high potential rating to focus field crews into more specific areas. Biodiversity planning is the same kind of theme, really. If we can get away from just using a simple age definition and use things like vertical complexity, the diameter distribution, the presence of large diameter stems, climax species presence, presence of coarse woody debris, all of those things can help us understand and quantify old growth better than simply relying on just age. A lot of this stuff comes together under this idea of doing predictive ecosystem mapping at a site level, using all of the detail we've just been talking about. So detailed terrain data that tells us about slope aspect and elevation, slope position, crests and depressions, the wetness index and moisture values. We add in the detailed vegetation data, we add in soils data, imagery data, and then climate data. Things like precipitation, degree growing days, mean annual temperatures or seasonal temperatures, those types of things. And all that data can be brought to bear in a machine learning world to predict fairly high resolution ecosite levels across a fairly large area very quickly. There's a project going on, multi-universities are working on this right now in BC, and it's a really interesting project, and we've kind of dabbled at it, and I see a lot of potential there. Complex stand management is another example where there's definitely some capacity for the new inventory work to play a role. And if you're understanding the range of heights and diameters in a stand with a full tree list, you can manage it a lot better than a simple polygon definition of a single height and a single age. Commercial thinning is another application. I'm just going to whip through this. We're kind of running out of time. Maybe some time for questions. But as we approach younger stands to get access for timber supply, we can target specific stands, maybe 30 to 45 years old, that have a certain level of basal area. Like Jamie showed, you can ping a polygon. It'll tell me, hey, this one's got 30 square meters of basal area, and I've got a species mix. I can, I'm just for an example, I'm going to zoom into an area and say LiDAR tells us where an existing road is, so we can use that in a landing, and we can use that as an initial starting point. I can look at the trees based on species, based on tree size, and start to put together a plan. In this case, I've got a machine that has a 10-meter boom width and 4-meter wide trails we're going to create. So I can quickly map out where the trails would need to go, assume all the trees within the 4 meters would be removed. So those are the exact trees that would come out. I can summarize those trees. It's about 6.2 meters of basal area. And my target was to take out about 10 meters of basal area. So the remainder area I'm going to look for is about another 5 or 6 meters outside of the trails. I can use a selection process to grab those trees. In this case, it's just a pretty simple one, just the larger balsam stems. We grab those and I've got another 6 meters. So I've got a total of about 12 meters of basal area in my prescription. And I've got a very detailed image of where that would happen to be. I can then, do a quick summary on all these selected trees, and it represents about 78 cubic meters per hectare being removed, 258 stems per hectare, and I can understand the species mix, the heights and diameter ranges of those stems, and basically pre-plan a commercial thinning entry with a lot less field work on the ground. So again, significant cost savings with the pre-planning in the office to be really effective at implementing these more complex prescriptions on the ground. Other applications, I'm going to run out of time, so I'm just going to fire them off. Things like improved fires and fuel mapping, understanding horizontal and vertical complexity of fuels can be supported with LiDAR. Improved bioenergy and biomass estimates, and things like carbon storage are directly linked to biomass estimates. So all of these things are just get better with increased information and data. Okay, so the very last thing I was going to hit was a key piece of when you fly LiDAR, you need to make it available to your users so that you can maximize the value from it. If it's sitting on hard drives somewhere that aren't accessible to people, it's a real challenge for people to maximize the value from the product. So ideally, it should be able to be accessible to people in ArcMap to support planning and analysis. And it should be ideally, hopefully available in a web map environment to support office and field crews when they're in the bush. Foresight has worked on a process of hosting that LiDAR data for us and others, where you can literally drag and drop it into an ArcMap, whether you're sitting in Edmonton or Salmon Arm or Prince George or wherever you happen to be. We build web maps that integrate LiDAR as well, and we've created a process where you can actually download chunks of LiDAR data. If you need to do a road design on your area, you can download the chunk, do your road design, and just purge it and not have to worry about storing these really large files, because we would have it backed up on our servers. So key there is you got to make the LiDAR accessible, and we can potentially help you do that if you don't have the means to do it yourself. So as an overarching summary about the value of LiDAR and getting the return on investment there, you got to move beyond just making better maps and sending the field crews out to do the same thing they've always done. We got to leverage the improved inventories, ideally reduce road and cut block development costs by, we're hoping 20 to 35%. In BC, it's at least $1 a cubic meter in the interior, and probably $2 or more on the coast. Those are significant savings, but you don't realize them with just getting better maps. You have to do the pre-planning in the office first, and integrate that with your field routines. You definitely get improved safety outcomes and avoid challenging logging situations with difficult roads and/or crossings and/or difficult logging areas that they can't actually produce very well. Better safety, lower costs, and as I've just talked about, the improved non-timber outcomes are pretty significant. Being able to access that data to support all the non-timber values is really quite significant. Okay, so I'm going to pass back to Carly. We're going to do some questions, I think.
Great, thank you, Cam, and thanks, Jamie. We'll move into our question and answer time. We do have a number of great questions that were asked. I just want to let folks know that if we're unable to get to your question during the session today, we'll follow up with answers to questions.
Okay, I think I'm just going to kind of start picking some off from this top here. The first question that John put out was he's not familiar with ground-based LiDAR, terrestrial LiDAR. Imagine it's less expensive than air-based LiDAR. What's the cost for ground-based LiDAR collection? It's really, there's a charge out rate per day to use the actual equipment. It's not cheap equipment. It costs about 50 grand to buy, so kind of like a really high-end GPS unit. And it's just field staff running it. It doesn't take really high-end field staff to do it. You can run out and scan fairly significant areas in a given day. Hopefully that answers the question. You can follow up more with us if you like. Another question is the wetness index. Is the wetness index strictly based on topography, i.e. low spots are wet, low flat spots are wetter? It is entirely based, that image I showed you was entirely based on topography. So it's a combination of upland contribution area and the actual topographic features of the area. So I guess the simple answer is yes, it is based on simply on topography, and we had good success with that and understanding what's going on. Certainly, when you layer in things like soils and other things, the Alberta experience with wet areas mapping does a bit more of that. Our experience is that the pure topographic approach has actually given us a cleaner picture of what's going on, and then we bring in other features as part of the planning process. Eric has a question. In relation to your work on understory trees, have you developed meaningful metrics to measure fuel loading, things like crown bulk density and crown base heights? That's a great question. We are working on some fuel fire related metrics from LiDAR. I would call them still kind of in development. One of our recent hires did a master's degree in fire and fuel work, and that's something that we're currently working on for sure. Another question, what programs do you use for individual tree detection or area-based approach, Fusion, LiDAR 360, R, etc., and what program would you suggest to use? That's a great question. We predominantly use our own proprietary software for that. There's some really excellent open source software, things like Fusion and LiDAR 360 costs a bit of money. R as an example. Again, our segmentation algorithm, it works at a kind of a production scale over large land bases, and so we put a lot of energy into making that work and doing things like understory detection in the segmentation routines. I don't think any of the other available segmentation routines will do that, but they certainly can provide a good estimate of kind of the mature or upper tree canopy numbers. So we do use Fusion for some things when we develop metrics for area-based approaches. We do use LiDAR 360 as well, but we do lean heavily on our own proprietary software as well. Can you customize sorts for individual tree products based on location client needs? Absolutely. So once the individual tree inventory is created, it can be it's a Python script that custom bucks to whatever utilization spec that you would want to use. It can grow it over time and then rebucket to whatever spec you might want. Is LiDAR useful for assigning age? Well, that's a really interesting and challenging question. I'm going to park that one and say yes and no. That's a longer discussion, but I'm going to try to go through a few more questions. The simple version is site index, age, and height are all correlated. You need to have two to get the other one. So you have to. We have approaches that decide which out of those three we choose to pick in various circumstances. When LiDAR is coupled with color infrared photography, are we able to detect beetle infestation before the trees visibly turn red? My experience from that is the photography alone has been the better approach. LiDAR hasn't necessarily been. It's just generally not timely enough for us to capture beetle infestation prior to turning red. So if you need timely turnarounds, it's satellite data that's doing that, and there's some really excellent high-res satellite data out there now. It's generally not a LiDAR product. Jamie, what program are you using for road and D-line analysis?
So this program is actually it's a tool that was actually developed by some of our own folks in-house. That basically it's a program that feeds off of the DEM within the ArcMap environment. So that's actually Foresight proprietary type program that we use.
But you do use RoadEng as well, and RoadEng does a similar type of deflection line analysis as well. We just developed the tool to spend more time in ArcMap to make it more efficient. When we need to get into the heavy lifting, then we move out to RoadEng to do the design work there.
That's right.
Do the number of points per meter squared matter considerably in terms of species identification? So when you fly LiDAR data, if you're hoping to do individual tree, you'd want to spec at least 8 points per meter or better. The more points there are, the more success we have. The more points there are in a tree, the higher probability we have of getting an accurate species identification. Someone asked about the lifespan of LiDAR before recapture. What my experience has been, people are starting to refly after, at least 5 years, probably more like 10. It's certainly a case where the terrain doesn't need to be recaptured. It's really just recapturing the vegetation. The photogrammetric point clouds have been thrown around as an option to do that, as a cheaper way to do it. And we have yet to have the ability to try that. We'd love to try that, but the accuracy levels aren't quite as good on that. So if you're trying to measure tree height differences between 2 5-year periods, you have to have some pretty accurate numbers, otherwise the growth rate should be skewed. So it's a really interesting idea, but we're starting to move into reflying now, only in very few circumstances. What resolution of LiDAR is required to have reliable results? So I think that probably answers this question. So we're looking for at least 8-point LiDAR to do the individual tree approach. If you're just looking for really good terrain data, you can get away with less. Although our typical flight in Alberta recently has been flying 16-point LiDAR. Smaller trees, higher point density works pretty well. Costs have come down significantly on flying LiDAR. We're seeing costs to fly LiDAR, in the 60, 70, 80 cents range per hectare on flat, easy terrain, and $1.25, $1.50 for more complex terrain. How accurate is species identification when stem crown form changes with elevation and tree age? That's a great question. Our species recognition algorithms are generally, well, it varies on a number of things. It varies on the density of the points that are collected, the number of tree species present, and the other types of context information that we can bring to bear. But a typical answer for me on how good is our species recognition is 75% accurate. That's, if you want more information on that, let's talk about details. Maybe you can give me a call. Are the ArcMap tools available for purchase? The tool that Jamie was demoing is something that we've thought about that. It'd be a case-by-case basis. So, if you're interested in something like that, call me. We could talk. Field truth accuracy of species within complex ICH stands, differentiating fir from cedar and hemlock. Yeah, we've actually done quite a bit of field truthing of individual tree accuracy in both on the BC coast, in the interior, in top ICH stands. We have yet to do the Kootenay mix though. That's always going to be an interesting one. And we've done a heck of a lot in Boreal Canada as well. Let's see, machine learning for tree species identification. What kind of software do you use? Again, proprietary. We call it TSI, or that's our in-house software that does the machine learning tree species stuff. I've answered that one. Stand density. That's a good question. How accurate is the stand density? So when we do segmentation processes, how accurately are we getting stand densities? As you've seen with the image where we're starting to get understory, those density numbers are getting better all the time. But in general, we find all the big trees for sure. Sometimes there's over segmentation. You might say call it 2 versus 1. But we're definitely not finding all the small trees in a stand. So I would say our volume estimates might be 95% of reality, and our stem per hectare numbers are probably 75–80% of reality. So we're definitely missing the smaller stems with lower volumes. Okay, I think that's the end of the questions. So
all right.
Turn it back to Carly.
Yeah, so we've gone a few minutes over today, but I'm glad that we were able to get through everyone's questions. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. If you have any questions afterwards, feel free to shoot me an email, ccdrew@foresight.ca, and we also have Cam and Jamie's contact information up on the screen here. If you have any follow-up questions, you can address it directly to them. As well, if you have any feedback on areas, topics that you'd like to hear more information about, feel free to send that information along as well, either by email or you can publish that in the Q&A before we wrap up. Thanks again, everyone, and have a good day.
Have a great day, guys.
Thanks.